It's 2023, which means that Season 2 of Jujutsu Kaisen will be releasing this year in the summer. Many, including myself, are excited for what it has to bring. Season 1 was a masterclass in what makes a battle shonen good, with amazing fight scenes that were animated and choreographed extremely well, while also not forgetting how to make a cast full of enjoyable characters that don't feel like they take a backseat to the MC. This anime had it all, but even then was still receiving criticism from doubters, calling it overrated and critiquing things such as the power system and storyline. Of course, whether or not these criticisms were valid are heavily outshined by the fact that Jujutsu Kaisen was the #1 selling manga of 2022. So I don't think any of these criticisms faze Gege Akutami, but in defense of him, I want to go over the first arc directly after the anime ends, called Hidden Inventory, and give my analysis on why this arc may prove those doubters wrong if the ongoing support for Jujutsu Kaisen already hasn't. That's not to say that Season 1 was lacking, as I thoroughly enjoyed every part of it, but I want to give my thoughts on Hidden Inventory, as I believe it is incredibly well written, especially when you take into account that it is only about a volume and a half in length. So, Hidden Inventory is largely a flashback arc, specifically a flashback to when Gojo was a student at Jujutsu High. This is already an interesting idea from the get-go, as it is some backstory to help reinforce what is happening in current Jujutsu Kaisen. You get a feel for how the characters we know currently grew to be who they are now. You find out why Gojo is referred to as the strongest. You find out why Geto decided to turn enemy to Jujutsu High, with what we saw covered in Jujutsu Kaisen 0. You get interesting insights on how the Jujutsu Kaisen world works as a whole, and of course, you get to see some badass fight scenes that Akutami is so masterful at portraying. There's a reason that Jujutsu Kaisen looked so good when it was animated, because MAPPA had some extremely well-made framework. But anyway, Gojo and Geto are tasked with rescuing and protecting a girl named Amanai, also known as the Vessel, who will be part of a merger with the main dude who puts the barriers up around Jujutsu High named Tengen. However, there are two groups of people trying to prevent this. The Curse user group Q, who are trying to overthrow the Jujutsu world as we know it, and the Time Vessel Association, a group of people who worship Tengen as their deity. They believe him not merging with the vessel is the natural course of action that must be undertaken. Only problem is that if Tengen doesn't merge, the outcome could be catastrophic for the entire world. However, it is at this point that the main antagonist of the Hidden Inventory arc gets revealed, Toji Fushiguro. I wonder why that name sounds so familiar. Guess we'll never know. So how does Toji fit into this though? The two groups are both gunning to kill the vessel and prevent the merger. However, only one of them you could say is backed by Toji, the group that worships Tengen as their deity. And the only reason that Toji is on their side is because they're putting money behind it. However, Toji, while being monstrously strong and fast, is also extremely cunning. Toji uses this money to put out a bounty on Amanai, the vessel, as a way to get other curse users involved to wear down Gojo and Geto, since Toji is aware that no mere curse user could actually beat Gojo or Geto, essentially trying to make a potential fight between them easier. So one of the most interesting things about this arc is that, like any flashback arc, you get to see the minds of Gojo and Geto near the start of their Jujutsu careers. Geto is miles different than he appeared in Jujutsu Kaisen 0. He's kind to those around him, besides Gojo of course, and he believes that sorcerers are there to help the weak. However, in fairly stark contrast to Geto, Gojo makes it clear how he has a distaste for helping non-sorcerers, and loathes all the barriers put in place to achieve that. This, of course, is a clear divergence from how he acts in the present Jujutsu Kaisen. Of course, even though he thinks such things, he does understand his place and that he is there for the betterment of humanity. These two viewpoints, unsurprisingly, make a shift from the start of the arc to the end, which much more lines up with the Gojo and Geto we know now. But even with these disagreements, it is quite fun to see the dynamic between Gojo and Geto. They are quite literally the strongest, and you can feel the respect they have for one another even when they threaten violence towards each other. They are friends, which unfortunately makes later events even that much more hurtful for Gojo. But This arc isn't just about Gojo and Geto. It is about what happens when the two strongest meet someone that is potentially stronger. Toji, the orchestrator behind the protection mission. Toji may as well be the antithesis of all Jujutsu sorcerers. With his heavenly restriction, he quite literally has no curse energy. In exchange, he has superhuman abilities in terms of strength, and even his 5 senses being buffed to unheard of levels. Sound familiar? The build up from the start of the Hidden Inventory arc to the end of Volume 9, where you consistently get to see Toji flash in and out of panels, setting his master plan into fruition, does so well to create suspense and pose many questions for the audience. Even after reinforcements of Gojo and Geto being the strongest, you can't help but wonder if that is even true. Such confidence from Toji that doesn't err on the side of cocky like it does with Gojo, it is a looming uneasiness that is cast over our protagonist. Even though we know where Gojo and Geto are in the future, there's still a sense of anxiety with what may happen with them now in the present arc, which I think is a splendid feat of storytelling in making the flashback arc even more uneasy and suspenseful for the audience. So at this point, Gojo and Geto have gotten Amanai back to Jujutsu High. Gojo, having been up for 40 hours with no sleep, is fatigued and vulnerable, exactly what Toji was banking on. This leads to Toji being able to catch Gojo off guard, as his infinity was not activated at the time. When creating a character that is as overpowered as Gojo, it becomes apparent that a problem arises. If they are too powerful, the show has no suspense. If the characters can just wipe away all the troubles with the palm of their hand, then there's nothing to look forward to for the reader. Akutami, however, has shown in the past that he is competent in dealing with this issue. He has created circumstances to show that Gojo himself isn't a foolproof plan to beat everything that threatens the Jujutsu world, and this is just another example. Gojo's own inexperience at the time is his fault. Gojo and Geto get defeated by Toji, which at face value makes absolutely no sense. But upon a closer inspection, you start to understand why Toji was formidable. These curse techniques that sorcerers so heavily rely on, completely nullified by someone who can't even use a single curse technique. It is not a stretch to say that it actually makes sense that Gojo and Geto lost to Toji, as they were never prepared to fight someone like this. So at this point, Toji essentially completes his mission. He brings the vessel to the aforementioned group I talked about. So what happens now? That was actually the exact question that I asked myself when I first read it. You see, that's the thing about this arc that I mentioned earlier. We know that Gojo is alive in the future, and even still, Akutami created suspense and anxiety within the audience. He took the strongest character we know, that borders on immortal, he set the scene in a time before the current time Jujutsu Kaisen is set in, and he was still able to invoke emotion from us seeing Gojo die. Gojo, of course, is not actually dead. In fact, this stunt that he pulls really sets in stone how far above Gojo is from everyone else. He has gone from being touted as the strongest to being unquestionably the strongest, pulling off reverse curse technique, something he had never been able to perform until being placed on the brink of death. I can't even describe how insanely cool this chapter is, and this is probably the thing I'm looking forward to most being animated. Gojo almost seems insane, what with defying all odds, and even in this crazed state, he shows why it is him alone that is the honored one. Side note, while editing, I of course thought of more to say, so I'm going to mention this here. Throughout this entire fight, Toji's inner monologue is pointing to his uneasiness about his fight. He literally stabbed Gojo through the throat, and yet here he is, appearing right in front of him as if nothing ever happened. I think the uneasiness that Toji feels is exactly what this entire arc is trying to encapsulate. It's what makes the arc shine. And I think that's what makes Gojo's character so amazing in general, even in current Jujutsu Kaisen, even with reassurement by nearly everyone in the series that Gojo is the strongest, uneasiness is all you can help but feel even when victory is almost assured. Akutami created an overpowered character that we know has the credentials to back it up, but we still can't help but feel like something may go wrong at any second. He doesn't feel like a shonen character that will always have an ass pull to fix any situation. He feels like a character that is heading to an inevitable wall, just like he did in the Hidden Inventory arc. I might seem like I'm rambling about this, but I can't find any other way to put it. Uneasiness in a situation where you shouldn't be feeling it. That's what Gojo creates. Also, this panel is fucking amazing. I try not to curse in my videos, but you know, it's warranted. This is the culmination of the Gojo we have seen so far, the pinnacle of the Jujutsu world, And even with the great achievement that Gojo managed, they still failed the mission. There's no glory in this, and you can see it on Gojo's face as he poses the idea to kill all of those surrounding them, those being the group that were after the vessel. Throughout this entire arc, I always had the question in the back of my mind of why did Geto turn enemy to Jujutsu High? It is clear that this is probably the main reason for this arc to exist in the first place. He's one of the main protagonists throughout, and in the way he speaks, there was no clear reason for him to go rogue. Funnily enough, it would actually make way more sense for Gojo to be the one to abandon his morals, what with the comments that I mentioned earlier. However, the previous failure to properly secure the vessel stuck with Geto throughout the entire 1 year time skip. He started to believe that those he originally swore to protect were not worth protecting in the first place, that the curses spawned by hatred were some of the foulest things there is. Upon closer inspection though, it makes sense. Of anyone that we've met so far in the Jujutsu world, he is the one who has mastered curse spirit manipulation. He has been closer to these curses than anyone else. He has tasted the curses, he uses curses to his benefit, he alone knows the extent to their disgustingness. One thing he did not know until the ending of this arc, which is the catalyst for his actions in the future, is that humans secrete much more negative cursed energy than sorcerers, so much so that sorcerers almost contribute nothing to the creation of curses. This simple fact is exactly what Geto needed to push him over the edge. In a world without non-Jujutsu sorcerers, you'd find yourself in a world with no cursed spirits. Essentially meaning that if you wiped out everyone that didn't have the ability to control their cursed energy, so regular humans, then you'd find yourself in a world where you didn't have to worry about cursed spirits anymore. So this is ultimately the conclusion that he settles on. You could even consider this the true climax to this arc. So that is the story that takes place in Hidden Inventory. It is a relatively brief look into the past of some pretty influential characters in the story. Personally, I think it is done extremely well. Sometimes in anime, flashbacks can be kind of boring or uninspired. Flashbacks aren't always given the same amount of care as the main story. Usually they're just there to pad the story or to provide small amounts of context. Even more so when the flashback isn't necessarily centered around the MC. Hidden Inventory is the exact opposite. I would read an entire manga just about Gojo and Geto's backstory. The dynamic between them is unmatched. Seeing a more immature and unhinged Gojo was fun because you can see the growth that he sustained to get to where he is now. Getting to see how Geto became who he is currently was also extremely intriguing, but also extremely saddening. The respect they harbored for each other and the bond they shared, it places a veil of sadness across the entire arc, knowing what we know about the future. Toji is an extremely well-made villain, such a simple motive, but also a heavy contrast between him and his opponents, and even upon his death, you can't help but feel sad about it, especially when he starts talking about his son. If this arc gets the same amount of care that the first 8 volumes did when they were adapted, then I have no fear that it will be anything less than amazing.